Well, we'll start as people still are joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. My name is Nick Buxton. I work at the Transnational Institute and coordinate the Knowledge Hub and have been one of the co-organizers of this course. We're really glad to have you join us. This is a really critical conversation that we're going to have, and welcome also to those who are watching afterwards within the course module. The focus for this conversation that we're going to have today is on digitalization on the security state, and it's part of the course that we've been running now for 5 weeks. We're very grateful to the course partners who've been part of organizing this course. This was organized by TNI, and it was co-sponsored by IT for Change, Statewatch, who particularly helped us with this module, and SOMO. We had a team I'd like to just acknowledge who also worked on this, who put a lot of work. Sofia, myself, Pia, Jess, and Guillermo and Yorit, who did a lot of the website stuff. We're next going to, well, basically we're going to talk this week about the 5th module, which is digitalization and security state, because we really believe that it's not possible to understand digital capitalism without examining the security infrastructure that underpins and enforces it. And that's why the session had to be part of the course. As we will discover, big tech corporations and state surveillance are not separate entities when it comes to security, but very much intertwined. And it's critical to understand how states deploy digital tools to surveil and control populations, to see who is targeted and how we might hold them accountable. And it's critical to understand how corporations underpin the state structure of control and coercion. So I'm really glad that for this session, we will have Chris Jones of Statewatch moderating the session. Chris developed the module for this session and has long been a friend of TNI. He can tell you a bit more about Statewatch, but they're a small but very critical organization defending civil liberties, human rights, and democratic standards, with a focus particularly on Europe. And at TNI, we've been honored to work with Statewatch for many years. Chris has worked there since 2010 and been its director since 2020. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thanks for having me, and hello to everyone who's here. Yeah, so our aim today is to complement the materials that you'll already have read, and to allow to have you here to listen to the esteemed experts we've invited and to ask questions to them. You can ask questions throughout the session. You just need to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we will also be sharing links throughout the session to resources and further reading in the chat. And obviously, we know that all those here have a lot of knowledge, so please feel free to share your thoughts and your links in the chat as well. As Nick said, I work for Statewatch. Statewatch is an NGO based in London. We've been operating since 1991, and we produce research and policy analysis and investigative journalism on issues pertaining to civil liberties in the state. So a lot of work on police powers, immigration controls, surveillance technologies, many things that are relevant to the subject we're here to talk about today. And just to briefly sort of set the scene, I wanted to share an experience I had yesterday. Yesterday was May Day. I was on a demonstration in London. And as the police are inclined to do here, and probably in many other countries, they filmed the entire action from start to finish. That is obviously nothing new. They've been, the police have been observing demonstrations since the police were set up. But what is different, over the last 10, 20 years is the increase in powers driven by digitalization, effectively in digital technologies. So they filmed the entire protest, all the people who were there, it's about 500 or 600 people. And the question there is, what happens to the videos that they take? We don't know for sure. We can assume that the footage is all stored in an archive. That also then makes it possible for them to apply facial recognition to the footage, in turn allowing them to log people's movements, to cross-reference that footage with footage from other demonstrations, work out who's standing with who, and therefore work out potential connections between people and different groups of people and track locations across time. So this is a form of intelligence gathering that is obviously useful for infiltration or for arresting people, or other ways of undermining movements. What was notable yesterday was a mildly confrontational action, I would say. A lot of people were wearing masks of one kind or another. But what happened during the pandemic was that many companies began developing software that can recognize people's faces even when they're wearing a mask. So that form of trying to hide our identities may not actually be that useful anymore. The point being of this, that digitalization vastly increases the powers of the police, and the technologies that enhance those powers aren't necessarily developed by the police. They can be developed for commercial purposes or other reasons, and then purchased by police forces and used for their purposes. That's the sort of real life, in-person, physical world example, but obviously we also generate very large amounts of data and reveal a lot about ourselves when we use digital devices. And I know that prior to this session, people were asked a couple of questions on this topic. So we have a couple of word clouds about what data systems people interact with. The larger words are those that came up more often. And what I think is really noticeable about this is that all the systems or companies in the word cloud, or almost all of them, are huge internet companies. That's obviously not very surprising, but it shows the extent to which a small number of very large corporations have monopolized the digital information infrastructure that we all share and depend upon. And then there was another slide, another word cloud generated. People were asked what data about themselves they shared. And if you look at this, I mean, it's incredibly revealing if you were able to put all this in one place. Consumption preferences, addresses, financial details, employment, taste in music, search histories, and obviously the biggest word there is location. So there are companies that know where you go and where you are much of the time. And of course, what we know from the Edward Snowden revelations 10 years ago now is that many of these companies share this information with security agencies. On which point I'll just return to a quote that was in the reading for the course by the Senior Advisory Group to the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And that report said, the government would never have been permitted to compel billions of people to carry location tracking devices on their persons at all times, to log and track most of their social interactions, or to keep flawless records of all their reading habits. And the point of the report was, we can't do that as the government, but the companies have. And that's potentially very useful to us. So on that point, I'll just very briefly introduce the panel of speakers we have here. I'll give more detail about them as the conversation goes on. We have Ben Hayes, Petra Molnar, and Marwa Fatafta with us. And first to make an intervention is going to be Ben Hayes. Ben is a former colleague of mine at Statewatch and currently an associate of the Transnational Institute. He's also a founding director of AWO, a data rights agency, and he's worked since the late 2000s on issues related to international security, surveillance, human rights, and civil liberties. Amongst other things, AWO challenges big tech with legal cases on civil liberties and develops proposals for policies on data that protect human rights and defend the public interest. Ben has also worked for many international organizations, including the UN High Commission for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and he has considerable expertise on Europe's security industrial complex and the shrinking of civic space, in particular as a result of counterterrorism policies. So my first question to you, Ben, prior to your 10 minutes, the clock starting on your 10 minutes, what's the big picture with regards to digitalization and security? What do you know from your work in terms of the processes, the key actors, key trends, and key problems that arise from that? And you are on mute.
We were just talking about how much progress we've made since the pandemic and how we don't have to remind people to unmute themselves. So thanks, Chris, and thanks to all the organisers, of course. It's lovely to be back here with TNI colleagues and old friends, and nice to be talking to so many people in different parts of the world. What's the big picture? I was thinking about this, and I've got a really rubbish answer to start with, but I think it sort of leads on to some things that are worth exploring. And just, the big picture is really that both technology itself and security policies underpinned by that technology are developing so fast, it's in the first instance just a struggle to keep up with it. And though it's a rubbish answer, I say this for a reason, because I think it's interesting to think about how the way we think about surveillance itself has sort of changed over time, at least here in Europe. And Chris mentioned that we were former colleagues at Statewatch, and I started working there in the sort of late 90s. And at that point, like CCTV, like surveillance cameras were sort of new and shiny. And sort of looking back, while our concerns about them were well founded, especially as Chris said, now we have facial recognition and all of this sort of much more sophisticated tech, they were sort of pretty novel and isolated, and the sort of concerns were even seen as a little bit sort of marginal or even sort of somehow geeky. But by like the early 2000s, we and I think many others were sort of talking about the emergence of a surveillance society, and there was quite a well-known report by the UK Information Commissioner, 2004, called "Sleepwalking into a Surveillance Society." That was published 20 years ago, and of course, 20 years later, much of what was being predicted then, has come to pass. And I think now, sort of wherever we are in the world, we are all of us here living in societies characterized by mass surveillance to a greater or lesser extent. But I think there's also some important differences in terms of sort of what was predicted and the impact that this is now having that are worth exploring. I'll just make sort of 2 points. The first is that, much of our advocacy at that time was characterized by a sort of, I don't know, some sort of inevitable path towards Soviet-style authoritarianism. So there was lots of references to Orwell's Big Brother and Stasi and so on. And I think this was sort of perfectly understandable, given that 20 years ago, the only locus for surveillance and the state, for surveillance was the state and its ideology. And people in liberal democracies who are raised on a Cold War diet sort of, this framed their fears and expectations. But what this did was completely overlook a rather long and inglorious history, as Chris said, of surveillance and control by liberals democracies themselves, in the colonies, in anti-communism and the Red Hunts, in the suppression of protest and dissent, and in the policing of minority communities. And I know these are things that we'll come back to in the conversation. And then I think, also as Chris said, while many of us could see that developments in information technology would revolutionize surveillance and place incredibly powerful tools of surveillance and control in the hands of government, very few people foresaw, the advent of social media, less still that people would choose to broadcast their private lives and political opinions. And I don't think anyone could really have imagined the extent to which, just how quickly, how much of our social and material lives would move online, regardless of whether we're on Facebook or TikTok or whatever. So going back, and I'm showing my age here, but going back to the difference between the surveillance my generation predicted and the surveillance we've ended up with. On the one hand, as Chris said, we have this sort of massive production of data on an unimaginable scale, and everyone creating digital footprints of almost everything they do. But on the other hand, we haven't quite seen the emergence of sort of Stasi 2.0, like, at least here in Europe, And I think, why the advocacy of 20 years ago is an interesting point of departure for me, is that what it didn't understand then, but I think it does now, and this gives me some hope, understand perfectly well, is that surveillance, does not affect everyone equally, right? I think we all know that here on this panel, and probably if you signed up on this course, but rather that it exists, as it always has, primarily as a means for states and elites, and indeed whole societies, to discipline and control those elements it deems inferior, unruly, or threatening to the status quo. And, if we had more time, we could maybe talk about some of the people who did see this coming, like Foucault and Bauman, but that's a conversation for another day. But so for me, the big picture is one of massive surveillance innovation, producing these pernicious, horrifying surveillance infrastructures that have transformed the means of policing, if not the nature of policing itself. So that's the first bit. Who are the key trends and actors behind these shifts, I think, was the second part of the question. And obviously, we've already talked about states and technology. It follows that we need to talk about the role of the security and surveillance industries. And I guess, I sort of had a fairly long and drawn out introduction talking about the things we did and didn't predict, but I think it's fair to say that, you know, activists and surveillance scholars were not the only people who had predicted where surveillance was heading, and key in the emergence of what are now global security and surveillance industries worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually, I think have been two things. One is sort of classic entrepreneurship among those who could see even in the 1990s that CCTV and surveillance cameras were just the beginning, and that there was a big market for hardware and software, you know, that might support surveillance and the opportunities this brought. And they founded enterprises off the back of that, and they continue to do so. I think what's changed now is that we see a clear revolving door between these kinds of enterprises and states. So people moving from the police or intelligence or government into this industry, and vice versa, of course. I think the second, and perhaps the more important thing, is like a key pivot from the much bigger defense and security industries, so companies which primarily produce the machinery of war, who realized after 9/11 just how big the homeland security and counterterrorism markets were going to be, into all things security and surveillance. And importantly, this wasn't just about market diversification, right? What it also meant was that the tools of war could and would now be repurposed into tools of surveillance and security and what others have termed pacification. So everything from surveillance drones to so-called less lethal weapons. And finally, I guess the last thing I wanted to sort of introduce and try and set the scene with this big picture, if you like, and if I still have a couple of minutes, I just want to talk about securitization, or we at TNI and others have termed processes of securitization. So while sort of states often working hand in hand with corporations have actively and aggressively pursued new means and tools of surveillance and passed laws that enable and legitimize their use, the kinds of things you've been learning about on the course, particularly as part of the war on terror, we need to understand securitization as a broader process in which surveillance and control may not be the primary objective, but is almost inevitably its outcome. And here we can sort of make a distinction between financial securitization, where the term is more commonly used to describe the de-risking of investments, though there are some interesting parallels, and the securitization of public policy and making the provision of public and private goods codependent on mitigating the risk posed by threat actors, which is ultimately to say the people that elites and societies are worried about. And so here we could talk about border security or transport security or critical infrastructure security, even food and environmental security. And I think how the securitization of these domains is characterized again by a greater or lesser extent by the emergence of underlying surveillance architectures that seek to identify threats and mitigate risks. And in turn, we can then explore the way this can sort of transform governance and impact the governed. And if we had time for a case study, I think we'd surely be talking about health security and the extraordinary measures introduced by governments across the world during the COVID pandemic, and how they too had some very differentiated societal impacts and an undoubted surveillance legacy. And I think, you know, whether or not we choose to engage with the concept of securitization, it might not be that helpful. I think one of the core lessons for me in terms of how surveillance has been developed and consolidated is a need to recognize how different geographies and political arenas and social policies have been and still are like key testing grounds for surveillance and control, for policies and practices that have then been rolled out in much wider contexts. As I said earlier, I think we're now starting to recognize the clear continuum from sort of colonial administration and the low intensity warfare that it declared and deployed against struggles for liberation, you know, through the war on terror and through to the policing of contemporary social movements. But I think there's also other key spaces that have had a tremendous impact in terms of shaping contemporary surveillance and control. You know, the kinds of stuff Chris was talking about was first sort of, these were extraordinary surveillance measures at the time, the idea that you could film all these people in a given location, etc. You know, these were introduced at football stadiums in the 1990s. they're then pushed out into the policing of demonstrations and then emerge into this sort of tremendous surveillance enterprises that characterize sporting events. We can talk about airports, the distinct role of surveillance there, the financial system, the criminal justice system, immigration control, the moderation of social media content. All of these things ushering in distinct types of surveillance with distinct impacts. And again, I guess I'll finish by saying, if we had time for one case study that sort of brings a lot of this together, and I think this time I'm happy to say we do sort of have time for that, we have to talk about the role of surveillance technology in Israel's occupation and establishment of an apartheid regime in Palestine, and how these technologies have been exported around the world precisely via some of these vectors that I've talked about in terms of the security and surveillance industries. So with that, I hope that was helpful, and I'll hand back to you, Chris. Thanks.
That was very helpful, very interesting, very insightful. Thank you. And yeah, well, thankfully, given your closing note, obviously we have Marwa with us, and on the topic of how certain areas or population groups or places are made, turned into testing grounds for different forms of surveillance and control. I'm also very happy to introduce Petra Molnar, who will be our next speaker. Petra is a lawyer and anthropologist specializing in migration and human rights, and a former classical musician, which I only learned today. She has been working in migrant justice since 2008, first as a settlement worker and community organizer, and now as a researcher and lawyer. She writes about digital border technologies, immigration detention, health and human rights, gender-based violence, as well as the politics of refugee, immigration, and international law. She's the co-creator of the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is a collective of civil society, journalists, academics, and filmmakers interrogating technological experiments on people crossing borders. She's also the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University and a Faculty Associate at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And her first book, The Wolves Have Eyes, Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, is published, or will be published, or already has been published with the New Press this year. So my question to you, Petra, to set you off, you'll have 10 minutes, is how do some of the trends Ben has described play out at the borders? And what does the smartification of borders mean in terms of how surveillance and coercion happen in the contemporary world?
Thank you so much, Chris, for that generous introduction, and to all of you for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here and share some ideas about what is happening at the border as a case study that will hopefully allow us to kind of dive deep on a particular area. First of all, though, I do want to, of course, acknowledge the current situation that's happening on campuses around the world. I've been privileged to be able to go and support some of them as somebody who has one foot in academia at all times. And it's been really amazing to see students showing up for the Palestinian cause, but also very worrying, of course, recognizing that surveillance that is tested out in other areas, such as the border, is also making its way into protest movements, which is nothing new, as Ben already outlined, but I think it sets up our discussion today. But what I want to do is just spend a few minutes bringing us to the ground and looking at what happens in areas where people are crossing borders and when they are on the move. As Chris said, I've spent the last 6 years or so working at the intersection of various borders, including fringes of Europe, the US-Mexico border, occupied Palestinian territories, and other spaces too, trying to understand how surveillance and migration intersect. And being able to steward and hold people's stories and the evidence that I've been lucky to get has been really, I think, once in a lifetime opportunity to try and get a global kind of sense of what is happening when we are talking about surveillance and migration. In particular, some of the projects that I'll try and draw into the conversation are both kind of the physical infrastructure of surveillance, but also some of the things that are a little bit more hidden. Some of the things that are perhaps less sexy than what captures, our attention or the headlines, but rather some of the more insidious ways that racism and technology and discrimination intersect, and the way that it, again, breaks along different lines of power and privilege, because ultimately, I think that is what we're talking about together today. The technology and surveillance is a lens through which to try and understand how power operates in society and how there are vast differentials between those who develop the technology and the communities on whom it's tested and why. But I want to bring us to the ground and also perhaps provide another example in addition to the European state of things and look at what's happening at the US-Mexico border. Because, of course, borders have been violent since time immemorial. They're also, of course, a social construct. But what I've seen in many others doing this work time and again, that already violent global border policies are sharpened through the use of different surveillance technology. And these technologies have, of course, real impacts, right? They separate families, they push people into life-threatening terrain, and they exacerbate the way that systemic racism operates in an already opaque and discretionary world of immigration decision-making. The US-Mexico context is an interesting one, though, because it's also very physical. You can drive up and see some of this physical surveillance infrastructure. This, of course, is one of the Israeli integrated fixed AI towers that dot the Sonora Desert that have been placed there to create this kind of deadly surveillance dragnet. But it also then gets very dystopic. And in one of the most surreal moments of my career, and I've had many, is when we were on the sands of the Sonora Desert. The Department of Homeland Security also announced that they wanted to be rolling out these so-called robodogs, military-grade technology that is now apparently planned to sweep the Sonora Desert looking for people on the move. Again, this is very dystopic. This is something I think that, grabs our attention, and it's something out of, a sci-fi movie. But what we have to always do is bring it back to the ground and remember that there are real people impacted by this, right? I had a chance to work closely with a search and rescue group there called the Battalion Search and Rescue, and we visited the memorial site of Mr. Alvarado, who was a young husband and father who unfortunately passed just mere kilometers away from a major highway. The thing is, states often say, well, we need smart borders, we need new technologies to deter people from making these routes, right? These dangerous routes. But that doesn't bear out in fact. People like Samuel Chambers and Jeffrey Boyce, for example, have been documenting for years the fact that surveillance technology and smart borders do not deter people from coming. Instead, what happens is people are forced to take increasingly dangerous routes, leading to loss of life. And so, as disturbing as it is, it's not that far-fetched to think that in the not-so-distant future, we will be seeing things like robodogs chasing people like Mr. Alvarado. I, of course, also like to show this photo often. For this crowd, I think it's pretty obvious that borders are a social construct, but this, I think, encapsulates it pretty clearly. This is, of course, the infamous Trump wall. It runs along the El Camino del Diablo, the Devil's Highway, and you can drive up to it. You can touch it. The rust will stain your hand for the rest of the day. But it also just ends, you can climb up that hill there and pop your head over to the other side. If that's not a social construct of borders, I don't know what is. And for the last half of my brief remarks, I want to bring it back to Europe, given the audience for this course today. And I know that this next photo is a bit difficult to look at, but it's an important one. This is from the region of Evros between Greece and Turkey. I spent about 3 years in Greece trying to understand how different technologies of surveillance are used there. And again, this is a deadly area where people have lost lives. And this is a beautiful cemetery that lies outside a small village in Evros. And it's been carefully being taken care of by the local village. And last time I was there was a relatively fresh grave of a young woman from Syria. There's still roses on top of her grave, perhaps as an act of care from somebody in the village. But as I was kind of paying my respects, kneeling down, something caught my eye. These 3 holes chewed into the ground, 3 open graves waiting. Again, this is the area where different types of surveillance has been tested out. We're talking about Frontex, different aerostat machines, extending the border into the skies, different types of walls, even experimental projects like sound cannons that emit piercing shrieks that were, a few years ago kind of proudly rolled out across the news. And all the while, people continue to lose lives as they cross into European territory. The last set of border technologies that I just want to briefly mention is also carceral technologies. This is a brand new refugee camp that you're looking at on the island of Kos, one of the so-called hotspots in Greece. And it's, Greece received massive amounts of money from the European Union to roll out this kind of brand new class of refugee camps that have been described as open-air prisons. They are full of NATO-grade barbed wire, different types of biometrics, different types of surveillance. But it's also actually about priority setting, because the camp on Samos, which was the first camp of this kind, had all this tech supposedly rolled into it, but didn't have running water 2 weeks before opening. I spent a lot of time on the island of Samos, and I got to know a young mom who was facing a forcible transfer into one of these camps. And on the evening of this transfer, she was reflecting on how she was feeling, and she quickly typed out this message so that my colleagues could also understand. And she says, if we go there, we will go crazy. Again, not hard to imagine why she might say that, right? But, I want our conversation to be a little bit broader and open it up to some of these bigger ideas of surveillance capitalism and what is really happening here. Because what we're ultimately talking about is a multi-billion-dollar border industrial complex where private sector entities get to set the stage and say, this is what we innovate on and why, right? There's a reason why robo-dogs and AI lie detectors and surveillance are seen as the kind of quote unquote solution to this intractable crisis of migration, right? All you need to do is to go to one of those conferences like the World Border Security Congress, where you will see private sector actors selling their toys to governments and say, this is what you need. This is the solution to a complex issue. But again, we need to strip this away and ask, whose priorities and perspectives matter when we develop technology? Why are we developing AI lie detectors and robo-dogs instead of using AI to root out racism at the border? That's a very clear normative choice that a set of powerful actors is making. But it's no accident. I think if I had to sum it up, the fact that we have these kind of high-risk tools at the border being used and tested without governance and regulation, and I'll get to that point in a second, this is not accidental because it allows for the border to operate as this kind of laboratory, a testing ground. It's already opaque and discretionary in terms of how decisions get made, right? Legally speaking, two immigration officers can look at the exact same set of evidence and render two different yet equally legally valid decisions. That's just how the system is built. So imagine if you start augmenting or replacing human decision-making with automated decision-making, AI, and different types of tools. Again, we're dealing with massive, massive power differentials here. But ultimately, it comes back to state control. It comes back to the fact that people on the move, migrants, refugees, stateless people are kind of the ultimate other, right? Somebody that has to be tracked, intelligible, and controllable and knowable. But given that our conversation today isn't just about the border, I also want to leave you with this. I do think the contextual specificity of the border and migration is very important because it gives us a case study to look at some of the sharpest edges of what happens. But of course, it doesn't stop there, right? That robo-dog that I mentioned, the New York City Police Department proudly announced last year that they want to roll out these robo-dogs again on the streets of New York to keep New York safe. One of them was even painted with black spots on it like a Dalmatian. So things don't just stay at the border, and we need to pay attention to how these projects kind of percolate beyond migration spaces. And also look at some of the less quote unquote sexy examples, things like algorithmic discrimination through visa triaging, different things that happen under the hood, right? Because ultimately it is about the way that we exclude those who are so-called undesirable and how we are able to normalize the use of this kind of technology in these spaces. So I'll leave it there. I do hope that we get a chance also to talk about how we can do things differently and how to perhaps work together in collaboration, because we are running this project called the Migration and Technology Monitor, where we work with people directly in displacement doing their own work on border surveillance. But I'll leave that for the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Petra, for those very sobering examples. And a link was shared in the chat about a campaign against this company Ghost Robotics that makes these rather foul robo-dogs. So do have a look at that. That's something we should all be supporting. And last but definitely not least, we're joined by Marwa Fatafta, Marwa works for Access Now, which is an international digital rights organization, and she focuses on policy and advocacy work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa region, and has written extensively on the digital occupation in Palestine and the role of new technologies in armed conflicts and humanitarian contexts and their impact on historically marginalized and oppressed communities. She's also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, which is the Palestinian Policy Network, and her work spans a whole range of issues at the nexus of human rights and technology, including content governance and platform accountability, online censorship, digital surveillance, and transnational repression. Thank you for joining us, Marwa. My question to you to start your intervention is, at this time of genocide in Gaza, how can we understand that in terms of the digital tools that underpin it and facilitate it? And what can you tell us about the role of digital security tools in terms of the infrastructure for Israel's wars and occupation? And how is that providing a model for digitalization and security globally? You two have 10 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And thanks for having me in this very important discussion. I think Ben alluded to Israel being a case study of how homeland security and surveillance industry can be birthed from state apparatus. And Israel is just one example where the surveillance industry and the state are, I would argue, in some cases are one and the same. It has a closely knitted military-industrial complex, and it's pretty much since the very inception of Israel as a state, it carried on the British tradition, where of course had colonized Palestine before Israel became a state in 1948, and they did the first kind of scanning and consensus of Palestinians as a population, and back then the Zionist troops took over these records. So let's start by saying that Israel has took on that colonialist tradition of ruling by records. And for settler colonial expansion, for land annexation, for oppression, for population control, and to enforce a system of apartheid, you need two things. One, you need to scan and excuse me, and surveil people, like who is who, and where and which lands do people occupy, and their relationship to each other. And you also need to use that information to dictate who has access to which part of the territory. And that's basically, in a very, very, very simple terms, how the system of apartheid in Israel works. It divides Palestinian communities according to their identities, and also based on that, they've built military checkpoints and border control and access based on which the state, or in this case, the Israeli occupation forces, decide where Palestinians can go, physically speaking, and as implications of that really impacts every parts of their life, including their work, their education, their family relations, who they get married to, how much access to water they have, access to electricity, telecommunications. And in the case of Gaza, sadly, even who gets to survive the ongoing genocide through automated AI systems. And so to build on Ben's point, I think, as I said, like Israel is a world leader in this homeland security. Themselves of the fact that we have to them threats since the very beginning, so we know how it works. We know we can show you how to counter terrorism. We know how to secure your airports. We know how to secure your borders. And so the Israeli surveillance industry, or the homeland security industry at large, from aerospace and border control to biometric surveillance, to spyware, to cybersecurity, there's a whole range of technologies and services that Israel provides. There's around 500 Israeli companies that specialize in homeland security, often promoted as battle-tested or combat-proven. And obviously, the war on terror in 2001 that started post the September attacks, proved to be a very lucrative opportunity for the Israeli industry. And just to offer like some examples to the extent of how that industry is making billions of US dollars in profit every year. In 2021, according to the Israeli Expert Institute data, the overall cyber experts from Israel back in 2021 reached 11 billion US dollars. And around 40% of the private global investment in cybersecurity funding are in Israel. And every war is launched on Gaza, we see that industry blooming again. And I'll share some concrete examples of how exactly that works. I want to say the first example to share here, where these technologies are first, tested on the bodies of Palestinians, on Palestinian communities. And again, let's not forget that in the occupied territories, pretty much there are no liberties, there are no freedoms, there are no rights. People in the occupied territories in the West Bank and in Gaza live literally under military rule. So all Israeli civil laws don't apply to them. And by virtue of that, it means you don't enjoy pretty much any rights. No right to privacy, no right to freedom of expression, association, or assembly. Like all these fundamental rights are violated on a daily basis. And also Israel doesn't recognize that international human rights standards and its obligations under international law apply to the territories they occupy. They say it's another territory, so we don't have any obligations. And therefore, of course, they can deploy any systems or technologies they see important for the oppression and the control of Palestinians. And that's pretty much, the pipeline of that industry. You deploy, test, and prototype these technologies on Palestinians without their consent, without any accountability, without any transparency, or any shred of regulation, let alone ethics. And then those who often serve in the Israeli military, once they exit, they take that knowledge and those skills and build companies. So it's not, for example, surprising to know that Israel has the highest surveillance industry per capita in the world. Many of the companies that the surveillance or spyware companies that come into under the light, come out of the shadows, are often or predominantly hailed from Israel. And they hail from that one particular unit in the IDF, Unit 8200, which is a military intelligence unit that develops many of those technologies. So, in the words of one of the soldiers that testified to how invasive the surveillance of Palestinians are, is like, we do it for free when we are in the army, so we might as well make some good money out of it once we finish the service. And as I said, because Israel does specialize in the so-called homeland security business, many governments see Israel as the destination to learn and to acquire that technology and those skills. So whether it be in getting technologies to be installed in certain borders, and I'll talk more about that in a bit, or getting the US police departments be trained by the Israeli military. There are numerous examples of how Israel has become the Mecca, so to speak, for governments that seek to import those technologies to control populations in their own respective countries. And in Europe and in the US, the two excuses are often the same: either migration control or counterterrorism. These are the two biggest excuses we see time and time again that governments use to justify the use of these pervasive and right-violating technologies. One of the examples I want to mention is an Israeli company called Anyvision. Now it's called Ostu, and this company is an Israeli company that is at least what it claims to be is a lead in AI recognition technologies, and indeed its tech is used in many different sectors and countries around the world. So from hospitals to airports. We did an investigation in Latin America, and we also found that the company has provided biometric surveillance technologies to countries like, for example, Argentina. That company, for example, Ministry of Defense, called Google Ayosh, which pretty much allowed the Israeli military to track and monitor the movement of Palestinians in the West Bank. And that company was awarded a top award in 2018 for that contract. And it was also revealed later that it upgraded or helped the Israeli Ministry of Defense to upgrade, at the time, 27 Israeli military checkpoints across the West Bank. And if you listen to the CEO or see some of their promotional material, again, they say that their technologies have been tested in the most security challenging environments, i.e. Palestine, occupied Palestine. So that's one example. Another example now, of course, Gaza, and we've all seen the terrifying revelations around AI automated systems to generate kill lists and target lists, where 36,000 Palestinians have been killed as a result, and big parts of Gaza have been literally pulverized. But Gaza, I think, is a microcosm of how dystopian this surveillance industry and surveillance state can be. And before even the current war started, it's known that Gaza is considered to be one of the most securitized, or has the most intense and most surveilled borders around the world. And Israel had deployed a number of technologies. They deployed automated robot snipers, AI-powered turrets set up along the Gaza border that created kill zones or automated kill zones that would fire at targets or anything basically that moves. They've also deployed unmanned ground vehicles and aerial vehicles, and the Israelis had even went as far to say that they've deployed the first military robots in the world that can substitute soldiers on the borders. And ironically, a week before October 7th attack happened, the Israelis did a tour for the NATO to show how borders, how high-tech border control and policing can be done. Obviously, the October 7th attack also showed us the fragility, right, of technology and tech solutionism, and that for me gives me a lot of hope that this is not all doom and gloom, and that in a way, I think governments also got drunk in their own powers and abilities and their trust in these technologies, to the extent they can actually control and surveil the populations. Petra mentioned the EU-Mexico border, and that's another example of how what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine, and shows the global nature of that industry and the global nature of oppression. For instance, the El Beit Systems Herman 900 drone, which, by the way, was first battle tested in the Gaza war in 2014. And a day after it was deployed, 4 Palestinian children who were playing football on the beach were killed. And Israel had hailed that attack as a precision attack. But that aside, and the whole snake oil hype about AI and what it can do, that Hermes drone is one of the most exported drones around the world. It was used on the US border in 2004. And I think they were actually the first unmanned aerial vehicles deployed in the US southern border. And a decade later, in 2014, the US Customs and Border Protection awarded El Beit Systems subsidiary in the US a contract worth $150 million to create a so-called virtual wall with these surveillance towers that Petra had shown us a picture of. Similar story in the EU, where Frontex had also awarded El Systems and another notorious Israeli aerospace company also responsible for the systematic violation of Palestinians' rights and their oppression, and that is the Israeli aerospace industry. They've awarded them a contract to provide also unmanned drones to control and surveil the Mediterranean area. So these are few examples that show us of how the inception of Israeli homeland security and surveillance technologies come from the oppression of Palestinians, their communities, their bodies, and their lives, and then end up being exported to replicate, maybe to a less dystopian levels, in different parts of the world. And I do want to finish on one note that industry, these technologies move, as I said, which is one important takeaway. And another is that some of those technologies are not just, this utopian tech. Some start pretty much in innocuous settings, or the technologies themselves can be innocuous, but can easily be repurposed by the state to crack down on people, to crack down on protesters, on migrants, on refugees. And it's not just, about AI systems generating kill lists like the Lavender or the Gospel being deployed in Gaza, or for example, these robo dogs, which can really take people by shock and surprise, and also by disgust. But again, we should pay attention to the systems that do govern people's lives on a daily basis, as Petra mentioned, because it will help inform the way we can resist that proliferation and its detrimental impact on our lives. So yeah, I look forward to continuing this conversation, and I'll hand it back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Marwa. Yeah, thank you for making very clear how and where these technologies start and how they are exported to other parts of the world. So we've got time for questions and conversation now. So if you are watching, and hopefully those interventions have given you plenty of food for thought, then please do put any questions you have in the chat, and we will pass them on to our panelists. Someone did ask whether we could write down the names of the companies you mentioned, Marwa. I don't know if you can do that in the chat, or if there's just a resource you can point people to. But yeah, please do share your questions in the chat. Before that, I've got sort of a few to get us started, and any of you are free to come in on this. If not, I'm just going to pick on one of you. So maybe we could start with what are the implications for social movements and struggles for social and environmental justice with regard to the increasing use of these digital tools and technologies for surveillance and the purposes of coercion? What does that mean for those of us trying to make a better world? How do we fight against them? How do we deal with them, and so on? I don't know if there's anyone wants to volunteer themselves for that question. Because like I said, if you don't, I'm going to pick on you. All right, Ben, you haven't spoken the longest, so I'm picking on you.
Fair enough, and I'll unmute myself this time. I mean, I think, it's already perfectly clear that we've learned the hard way that social movements are at the sharp end of the kinds of policies and practices we've been talking about. Never mind that sort of, as you and I will remember well, Chris, that, when a lot of the laws and the policies that paved the way for the sort of implementation of this stuff was happening, we were told at the time that this is what we needed to keep us safe from the threats of terrorism that we were then living with, as many people predicted. These serve a much wider social control purpose. I mean, what can we do about it? This is always where the conversation can get a little dispiriting. I think, as sort of, activists, social movements, we've got to recognize that the basic thing that we have to do in terms of digital security is raise the cost of surveillance for those people who are doing it, and do that by sort of using whatever technologies we have at our disposal, be that organizing on secure communication technologies like Signal, or even as you mentioned at the start of your talk, wearing masks to prevent re-identification from things like facial recognition. Ultimately, I think sort of Petra, I suppose spoke to this in her talk. We also, I think, just have to somehow address the sort of underlying policies and paradigms and structures of power. I think rather than this, I think this is what the sort of digital rights community has tended to do, is sort of get fixated on the technologies, and a new and shiny one comes along sort of every couple of years, and everyone comes out and says, this is terrible, and we have to challenge this, and then the next thing comes along, and the next thing comes along. I think, for social movements, it has to be about challenging the legitimacy of how we're policed and the role that states and surveillance infrastructures play in preventing the radical social change that I think most of the population in many parts of the world now recognizes that not only is desirable, but absolutely critically necessary.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, important to keep our eyes on the bigger picture rather than getting caught up in the latest gadget. Marwa, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I have 2 points to add to that question. One is, for me, the biggest challenge is that once the technology is unfurled, it's really hard to take it back. And COVID-19 was one example out of many where, the pandemic hits and many governments say, let's do contact tracing apps. And those have warned against, the privacy implications of those, that they can be repurposed at some point, like the governments were pushing back that this is obviously for fighting the pandemic, etc. But the thing is that with these, again, like examples where we're not talking about, we're not talking about not the controversial, but the thorny issues, whether it be national security or counterterrorism or border control, but we're talking about like day-to-day situations. Obviously, the pandemic was a crisis, but we're talking about like a health measure, right? And there, if people did not push, like what I want to say is that people should push against the digitalization of our everyday life, because those systems, once they're out, they're really hard to challenge or dismantle. And one of the examples I've seen in Iran, where the Iranian authorities used food ordering apps to identify protesters and their workplaces, and then go arrest them from their workplace. So, I don't want to sound like a Luddite and be against like all tech and digital development, but we need to scrutinize. And by we, I mean not only digital rights activists, but social justice movements and concerned citizens, that those systems can be innocuous, but can be easily repurposed. And most importantly, they cannot be dismantled once they're unfurled. And a second point, quickly, I want to refer to is Ben mentioned in his intervention that some tools of war can be repurposed. And what we see, at least in Gaza, is that some tools that are used in times of peace, like facial recognition technology in public spaces, or predictive policing systems, or predictive tools used in law enforcement and in the judicial sector, that can decide which areas that should be policed more, or whether an individual will likely commit a future crime. Those systems are the very systems that Israel uses now, for example, in Gaza. The Lavender system is one of those. It's one that ranks individuals, whether they are Hamas militants, and consequently make the decision whether they should be a target and added to a kill list. And that, to me, points to I'm sorry for sounding like a broken record, that had these technologies been fought against and banned, like facial recognition or predictive systems have been banned, it would be hard to see them being used in times of war. Although that is like the most dystopian usage of such systems. So it is really a banality of technology and their implications on our everyday lives.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just like to say, as someone who was trained as a historian, the word, not necessarily anything wrong with being a Luddite. The Luddites actually had a very clear idea about the technologies that were being used against them and how they were against their interests, and were opposed to them on that basis, not because they were new. So, put me in the Luddite camp, that's fine, in many respects. I think we'll take some questions now from the audience, which I think Pia has summarized for us.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you to all the speakers. It's very interesting to hear everything from you. I will just shoot a couple of questions from the Q&A. There's one, most of them are related to border controls. There's one from Frank, one of our students, that's saying about what about applications done in north of Africa to defy immigration to Europe? And then another one from Yvonne that says, what do you think that what is being done with the biometric registration data, the data related to the photos, the eye scans, the fingerprints? What do they do with all that information? How is it used, and what impact does it have on people that crossing borders?
Thanks. I would actually say to Yvonne, if you have a spare 3 hours, I can go through that with you in minute and incredibly boring detail, but we don't need to do that now. I actually think those two questions are related because obviously lots of people in North Africa do try to obtain visas to come to Europe and have to give their data over, and it's stored in very large databases, and that is one of the applications used in the north of Africa to prevent immigration to Europe. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to come in on either of those questions.
Sure, I can just perhaps add a few things that came to mind. And again, to me, it again starts from the kind of central conception of what a border even is, right? And with the use of different types of tools and technologies and data gathering, we've been seeing this trend where the border is externalized, right? Or pushed away from its physical location, or disaggregated from the kind of quote unquote traditional understanding of, you arrive here, you give your passport, then you cross into another jurisdiction, etc. But through the use of not only surveillance technology, but also this vast data gathering, the border has been extended into the skies, but also horizontally, right? And the whole purpose is to prevent people from even being able to reach European territory to then be able to avail themselves of the internationally protected right to asylum. If you can't even get there, then half the battle that the EU is waging is done, right? And this cannot be done without data. And like Chris is saying, the North Africa example is a really, really important context to pay attention to. Of course, not the only context, but where data is kind of the new oil, right? And your body becomes the border when you are forced to give up very sensitive and very body-oriented pieces of data, like an iris scan or fingerprinting and all of that. And just lastly, to me, it also speaks to the kind of dehumanization that is so common already in migration and border regimes. The fact that people become data points and eye scans and kind of slotted into these interoperable databases that then get shared and reshared between different entities, without actually thinking through what is this doing to people, right? And what is this, again, kind of reaffirming? And if that is the logic that animates the kind of decisions that get made and then baked into legislation and governance, right? Like the Migration Pact of the European Union and other kind of similar policymaking overtures in other jurisdictions, then we kind of have the answer. It's not about humanity or human dignity or even established principles of international refugee law, but it's about seeing all of us as just these data points that have become useful to this kind of global project.
Yeah, thanks. It's a very, very accurate assessment of the situation. Ben, you have your little yellow hand up there.
Indeed. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to maybe add a couple of points on biometrics and try to do that in substantially less than 3 hours. I think, you know, biometrics are so important in the context of surveillance and border management. And the reason for that is, you know, as I'm sure most of you know, is that they create this immutable identifier, this permanent identifier that allows people who've been identified and biometrically profiled at one point to be checked repeatedly and identified thereafter. And as Petra rightly said, the overwhelming reason that the EU has migration management policies pushing out further and further from the Mediterranean through not just North Africa, but other parts of the world, is to prevent irregular, as it's called, unauthorized migration to the European Union. But the reason it's invested so heavily, I think, in biometrics is that, as also, you know, as was also clear and is also self-evident to anybody, the borders don't work, they're porous, people continue to come. But once you've biometrically profiled someone, it makes it very easy to identify them from among the population and expeditiously detain and deport them. And that is really why we've had the creation of these vast biometric databases within Europe. And it's also why, you know, the initial purpose, which we were again told, you know, post 9/11, we just need this stuff to better manage, you know, immigration in an administrative sense. You know, we just need tighter document security. We need to know who's coming into our country, how long they're staying, and whether they're going home. Of course, you know, over time, these databases have been opened up to security and intelligence agencies to use for a whole range of other purposes, which I think characterizes, as others have said, the way surveillance technology tends to develop. I think the last thing I would say is that, you know, if I was to hazard a guess, you know, we might start moving away from some of these biometrics that are quite challenging to both collect and process towards, you know, the kinds of stuff that Marwa was talking about. You know, facial recognition is becoming ubiquitous, and, you know, that together with the other digital traces that we leave everywhere, you know, linked to this, it's no coincidence that, you know, more than half European Union member states have passed laws authorizing the confiscation of the mobile phones of people who arrive irregularly in the European Union, just so they can look back through these digital footprints and say, well, look, we can tell you came from here, and we're going to expeditiously send you back there because we deem it safe or whatever. But I think it's yeah, just a sort of bit of detail on the broader point that Petra made. Back to you, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think Pia has another question from the audience, actually.
Yeah, I'm just putting two questions together. In terms of that you're saying, do you think that regulation should be the only solution to address these problems? And if there isn't another way to imagine a world without using this kind of technology, there's another which is kind of related that says, how should we envision a possible future that untangles disincentives and relationships between state and corporations and using this data?
All right, big question. Well, Petra, you have your hand up.
Thanks for that. Yeah, lots to say here, because as somebody who is a very reluctant lawyer, but still a lawyer, regulation is front of mind often. It's a tricky one, right? Because on one hand, I think we've seen how we really need to think through governance and regulation in the space of surveillance and border tech particularly. But I think the answer is more complicated. We need to think about national, regional, and international ways to put some guardrails around this. And also have those really complex societal conversations about the inevitability of tech and this kind of techno-solutionism, right, that we almost all now seem to take as a given. And even those of us who are trying to fight against this, right, perhaps this kind of depression has set in where it feels like, oh my God, it's like catching the runaway train, and what do we do now? I do still think there are conversations to be had about red lines and moratoria or bans on some of the most kind of high risk draconian tech, right? But there's also ways that we just need stronger lawmaking when it comes to these technologies, right? Not even just in terms of a ban, but if they're going to be used, what are some of the safeguards in place? What do meaningful human rights impact assessments look like, right? What about accountability and transparency to the public, not to mention the affected communities? And I think it can be very depressing, right, to see how even something kind of as heralded as the EU AI Act, right, fell so short on border tech and so many other areas that we're talking about today. But I know it can get really depressing really fast. So I did want to just take a minute or two to perhaps share what's worked for us in a small, kind of concerted, grounded way. And I think a lot of it is about redistributing resources to affected communities and thinking through also how we produce knowledge in this space and who counts as an expert and who gets to talk about these things. That's something that we try and do differently at the Migration and Technology Monitor, which is a project that we've been running for a couple of years that funds people on the move directly to tell their own stories on border surveillance. So instead of, yet again, setting up another Western institution that gets to say, well, we are the experts, we really want to be able to say, no, like, let's think about funding. Let's think about how space is created for the kind of conversations that need to be had when it comes to the intersection of technology and migration in our case, but kind of surveillance more broadly. Because I do think that, yeah, this stuff takes time and working with community and working from the ground up sometimes isn't the sexy stuff that gets splashed, across like a press release of the European Commission or anything like this. But it actually does shift the paradigm and we can and should work differently. And the last thing I'll say, there's been so much siloing in this space as well, and just framing of issues in very kind of narrow ways. I think Ben referred to this when speaking to the way that the digital rights sector has kind of been so focused on the tech rather than on some of the underlying kind of bedrock or foundation of what is it that we're really talking about. And again, it comes down to power. Who gets to speak? Whose perspectives matter? And what is it really that we're innovating on and why? Like, these are some of the foundational questions that I think we as a space have to address as well and find ways to connect across our different lived experience and different disciplines and expertise to build a different world.
Nice to have some positivity as well. I was gonna try and inject some before we finish. Marwa or Ben, I don't know if you want to come in on those questions at all.
I'm happy to chime in. I agree with Petra. I think the problem with tech at the moment is lack of regulation, and I mean, obviously the EU is taking the lead with hits and misses. But what we need is more establishing more norms at a global level, and there are certain technologies that are inherently incompatible with human rights. Facial recognition is just one example. There is no way that you can install facial recognition cameras in public spaces and do it in a proportionate way and do it in a way that respects people's privacy. Spyware is a similar example where, like, exploiting zero-click attacks, and there is no way on earth that you can protect yourself against these types of attacks. So these types of tech needs to be banned at a global level. And those solutions won't work unless they are global in nature. Because again, I do hope we delivered the message strongly that the surveillance industry or the homeland security industry is a cross-border issue, and it can't be tackled at a national level only. However, we're asking states to be the protectors of those rights when they are the very actors that deploy or in some cases develop these technologies. And so they will always, find ways or loopholes to justify the use of some of that tech. And so I think, in addition to global norms, I think investor advocacy, investigating the corporate structures of that industry is very important. Understanding the, just basics of accountability, transparency, and oversight. Digging into the state contracts, who are they procuring, which companies, which technologies are they deploying, which are often are you know, they're sexy topics to be covered in the media once they're discovered, but digging into state documents, like in the EU, for example, is a tedious task. And this is where I think, you know, civil society and activists play a very important role, investigating and uncovering and unearthing those relationships between the state and industry, with the aim of, you know, scrutinizing and having oversight. And lastly, I want to say, you know, I hear that I hear the criticisms about the digital rights community, but I think also technologists play a very important role in dissecting to the general public what technologies are and what their harms can be, which companies won't do. Obviously, they're in the business of selling that tech. And as we said, like in the context of digital transformation, where governments are hungry for using tech and seeing tech solutionism as, you know, a silver bullet solution for many of the societal and political problems we have, they're very eager to obtain them. And yeah, technologists here play a very pivotal role in breaking down the myths around and the hype around some of those technologies.
Thanks. Yeah, and as Nick's just pointed out in the chat, there's also the important role of tech workers, those who produce the tools. And he cites the movement of Google tech workers against ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the US, and against the genocide in Gaza, both being important. I think it's also interesting to reflect on, as Petra said, like who, particularly in like Western organizations, who do we learn from? You know, are we paying attention to people who've been at the sharp end of this stuff for, I mean, centuries, really? We're talking about digital technologies, but, you know, technologies of control and surveillance are as old as the state itself. And also, you know, other movements. I mean, I'm sure it's been talked about in other sessions of this course, but the relationship between digital technologies and the environment is incredibly important and will be increasingly so in the decades to come. And it's really a question of who has the right to do what with the natural resources that we have on this planet, and what do we get to make with them. And most of this surveillance technology is an absolute waste of time, resources, and money. But I will pass over to Ben and stop my little rant there.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add on the regulation point. You know, I'm not going to start coming out and defending the EU AI Act. At the same time, you know, it was a disappointment to a lot of us who sort of campaigned and advocated around it, but it still does place at least some significant limits on the use of things like facial recognition. You know, ditto data protection law, right? It's really sort of, it's quite arcane and uninspiring, and it's has very limited utility in challenging state surveillance because if the state passes a law that says this kind of surveillance is legitimate, there's very little you can use data protection law for in terms of challenging that. But it does allow, it does place quite strong limits on what private companies can do with our data. And, you know, where it's clear that private companies have transcended those limits, it does offer some quite significant opportunities for redress. And like we at AWO, you know, we were founded off the back of the work that my colleague Ravi Nayak did on the Cambridge Analytica case. It was quite clear that Cambridge Analytica had presided over, you know, one of the biggest unlawful data gathering, sort of data harvesting exercises by a private company, you know, data that they harvested from American and other voters without their consent, and then sold back to political actors to help them try and influence elections. You know, and that Cambridge Analytica case started with a simple subject access request by an American professor who wrote to Cambridge Analytica, said, I think you have, you know, using Ravi as his solicitor, saying, I think you have my data. I'd like to know, you know, what data on me you have, what you're using it for, what your legal base for holding it is, etc., etc. Cambridge Analytica replied and said, you're an American citizen. We don't think EU law applies to you. We know we'll have to respond to your request, and we would a Taliban living in a cave. And that was the response of their of their lawyers, which was both wrong in law, but also disingenuous for people who subsequently looked at this case. But it meant, you know, we were able to go straight to court, and Cambridge Analytica had a hasty demise. The other example I'd say is, you know, Clearview, which was just harvesting photos from the internet, social media platforms. They were just harvesting en masse every photo it could get its hands on, together with you know, biographical data about the individual, and then just selling this technology to law enforcement agencies and others for the purposes of facial recognition. Here's a database of as many people we could construct actually in the world, and we can run facial recognition to find people you're looking for. And you know, that was another thing that was, you know, so abundantly unlawful in the context of EU data protection law that, you know, one after the other, state information commissioners and data protection commissioners went after them. And, you know, I guess, you know, the point I'm making, these are small victories, but given the choice between sort of the regulation we have and not having regulation of this kind, as many parts of the world do, I'm going to sort of stick my neck out and say I'd rather have a bit of regulation that could be improved than no regulation at all, even if it's by no means a panacea. And then just on the sort of question of like, well, what do we need? I think what we need and so sorely lack is courageous politicians, you know, politicians who privately absolutely agree with all of the stuff we'd be saying on this panel, but because, you know, the political capital vested in security is so immense, they are unable to sort of develop these kinds of ideas into, you know, credible political sort of programs and action. And so we need to find a way of identifying and working with these kinds of actors, and find a way of rewarding them for taking the kinds of stands that we'd like them to. Back to you, Chris.
That's actually a very neat segue into what will be my attempt for us to end on a more positive note. So thanks for getting that started. And yeah, we've got a few minutes left. So maybe just to finish, it'd be good for us to think about, as Ben sort of just begun with there, like what would it, you know, what would a progressive agenda look like that can hold to account state coercion and state surveillance and corporate surveillance? Like what do we need to be able to deal with this effectively? What do we have at the moment that we can use and that's effective? How do we build on that? And yeah, what does that agenda and those tools look like? Marwa, please.
I can start with one. I think transnational or cross-border solidarity and mobilization. And we use that, for example, with a number of European organizations in identifying how, for example, the EU is exporting and donating surveillance equipment to North African countries. And that would not have been possible by, let's say, Algerian or Moroccan civil society organizations, but others in the EU who have the right to access information or request information from the authorities. And so, you know, cross-border solidarity and organizing and investigation is key to tackle and understand this cross-border issue. I think that for me is a non-starter for a progressive agenda to push against this digitization wave.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's also very true in terms of like bilateral transfers of technology and capacity building and training from, for example, like you say, the EU to North Africa, but also the way in which many of the standards and technologies and tools are developed, right? I mean, a lot of this, you know, the very nitty-gritty, extremely dull for most of us stuff about technical standards, actually, some of that has a political edge, and that's developed in, you know, sort of obscure global bodies very often that, you know, organizations like ours don't necessarily have much interest or much say in. Petra or Ben, I don't know if you want to come on this question about what you know, what do we need to hold power to account? Do you have any thoughts on that? let's try and end on a positive.
Sure. I think, yeah, part of the conversation that we need to be having globally, as Marwa reminds us, is how so many of the issues that we're concerned about are interconnected. And maybe this is not the positive yet, but I mean, the way that border surveillance functions has a lot to do with capitalism and environmental destruction and corporate capture and all of these huge kind of issues that I think we are all concerned about and rightly probably quite scared of, right? And it can feel like this moment of deep despair, but there's also so much joy and resistance and contestation that is happening currently, right? And when we stop in these silos and actually look at the way that a lot of these issues are interconnected, it, at least to me, gives me a lot of energy and hope for the future, because we can build a different world. We are already doing it. We just sometimes, I think, also are caught under the way that the current media landscape operates, that it makes it seem like everything is on fire. Most things are, yes, I would say that's fair. But I do think that there are a lot of ways that we can actually shake things up and are already doing it. So despair is definitely something that I think we need to fight against and find ways of connecting with one another and tell complex stories of what it means to be a human moving through the world today.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And hope is important. And there's many places to look for it, not just now, but also in the past. If we look back into history and all the different struggles that have taken place and have won. So we should also take time to remember those. So we're going to wrap up here. So I just want to say a massive thanks to Ben and Petra and Marwa and to the whole team at TNI for all the organizational support and organizing this whole course. Very big undertaking, extremely impressive. This was the 5th masterclass as part of that course. Next week will be the last session of the course, and the focus will be appropriately, given what we've just been discussing, the digital world we want to live in. So alternatives to the securitized corporate tech space that we've just been examining. It's not just going to be a theoretical conversation. It's going to draw on the many practical alternatives and models that are being built and used. And on Monday, all the materials will be opened up for you to read and digest. And then the masterclass next week will be on Wednesday, not Thursday. So it's going to be on Wednesday at 4 till 5:30 p.m. CEST, which, if I'm not wrong, is Central European Summertime. So that's Wednesday, the 8th of May. And the class will be with Ekait Cancela, who I should apologize to for the way I've just pronounced their name, who's a journalist on technology and capitalism and author of Despertar del Sueño Tecnológico, a book called Awakening the Technological Dream. Anita Gurumurthy, who's the director of IT for Change, where she leads research and advocacy on data and AI governance, platform regulation, and feminist frameworks on digital justice. And Leandro Monk, who is the founder of G-Co-op and pioneer of free and open source software and cooperative platforms in Argentina. So another great lineup of speakers. Thank you to all of those who joined us for listening, for all your questions. Really hope you've got a lot out of this. I certainly have. If you could take a minute to fill in the poll, that's incredibly useful to the team at TNI to evaluate the session, so we know how they're doing. And we'll leave the chat open for a few minutes here, so you can leave any last thoughts or whatever you may wish to put in there. And if you've got any suggestions for improvement, then don't hesitate to send an email to digitalcapitalism@tni.org, and someone at TNI will be in touch with you. So thanks once again to all the speakers, to all the team at TNI, and to all of you, all the attendees, for listening. And yeah, the final masterclass will be back next week. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and thank you, Chris, for moderating.